Welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time joining us. I'm your guide through the quieter corners of history, the forgotten moments that shaped our world. Tonight we're stepping backward through time, into a world that appears so familiar to us through photographs and novels, yet was fundamentally alien in almost every way imaginable. The Victorian era, spanning much of the 19th century, has captivated our modern imagination. We see the grand architecture, the elegant clothing, the apparent civility and order. From our perspective, it seems like a romanticized past, refined, controlled, perhaps even restful. But the reality of living through even a single day in a Victorian household was far more complex, more demanding, and more physically challenging than most of us could endure. This is not a story of excitement or drama. Rather, it is a meditation on the simple, constant friction between human beings and their environment. It is an exploration of what comfort truly means, and how profoundly our expectations of daily life have shifted in just a few generations. So settle in, make yourself comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights if you wish. We are about to spend the next 2 hours gradually uncovering what it truly meant to live in the Victorian age. The world of gas lamps and heavy fabrics, of rigid routines and invisible labor, of discomfort so pervasive that it was simply accepted as the rhythm of existence. Let us begin not with the grand events or notable figures, but with the most intimate and immediate experience, the moment you would wake, on your first morning in a Victorian home. Imagine yourself stirring to consciousness in a Victorian bedroom, sometime in the 1880s. But before you open your eyes, notice what you do not hear. There is no gentle hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no background murmur of the modern world. Instead, there is a profound, almost eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling, the faint sound of wind at the windows, and perhaps, if you're fortunate, the distant song of birds. The first thing you would become aware of, even before fully waking, would be the cold. Victorian bedrooms were rarely heated. The concept of warming an entire sleeping chamber was considered wasteful and, indeed, unhealthy. The prevailing medical wisdom of the time held that fresh, cold air was essential for proper respiration and sound sleep. Heating a bedroom, many believed, would lead to weakness of the constitution, and so you would wake in a room where your breath misted slightly in the air, where your fingers felt stiff, and where the prospect of leaving your bed and the several blankets piled upon it seemed almost insurmountable. The bed itself is a curious apparatus by modern standards. It is high off the ground, requiring you to climb up onto it. This was partly practical. It kept you away from drafts near the floor and away from the occasional vermin that inhabited older buildings. But it also meant that the simple act of rising and lowering yourself from bed required a distinct physical effort, especially in the early morning when your joints were stiff with cold and inactivity. The mattress beneath you is not the uniform, springy construction you might be accustomed to. Instead, it is likely filled with wool, horsehair, or, if you are wealthy, a combination of materials. Over time, these materials compress and shift, creating lumps and valleys. The surface is not entirely uniform. In the morning, you would feel the places where the stuffing has compressed most heavily, and others where it has bunched together, creating a sleeping surface that is both rigid and unstable. Around you, the room is still dim. If you're in the early Victorian period, perhaps gaslight is available, but in the bedroom itself, such amenities are rare. Instead, there are candles on the nightstand, mostly melted stubs from previous nights. The walls are papered with a heavy, ornate pattern, likely dark in color. The furniture is substantial and wooden, casting long shadows in whatever weak morning light filters through the heavy curtains. The curtains themselves are a significant factor in Victorian bedrooms. They are not simple translucent panels. They are heavy velvet or damask, lined with additional material to block out light completely. This served a practical purpose. Gaslight from the street could penetrate thin curtains, but it also meant that your bedroom, regardless of what time of day it is outside, could be maintained in near total darkness. The only way to let light into the room was to physically cross to the window and pull back multiple layers of fabric. Your body, under all those blankets, has created a small pocket of warmth over the course of the night. As you contemplate leaving this nest, you realize that within minutes of exposing yourself to the cold air, your skin will prickle with goosebumps, your muscles will tense against the chill, and you will be shivering. This is not a comfortable transition. There is no gradual warming of the room by a thermostat. There is only the shock of cold. You reach for the bell pull, a cord hanging near your bed, and pull it. This summons a servant, who will in a few moments arrive with hot water for your washing. This small luxury, hot water brought to you, is only available to those of means. For most Victorian people, any water had to be hauled by hand, heated on the stove, and carried to the necessary place. The fact that hot water appears in your room, delivered by another person, is a sign of your social standing. A servant arrives carrying a large ceramic pitcher and accompanying basin. The water steams slightly, a small mercy. You pour some of this water into the basin and, steeling yourself, begin to wash. The Victorian washing routine is a far cry from the casual shower of the modern era. There is no shower. There are no fixtures that deliver water from the ceiling. Instead, there is this pitcher and basin, and cold, clean water for rinsing. You wash your hands first, then your face, then your neck and ears. The water is already beginning to cool in the ceramic basin. By the time you've finished, it is distinctly lukewarm. If you need to wash your hair, it is a process that takes hours and requires assistance. Hair washing day is a major undertaking, not something to be done casually every morning. Your undergarments for the day are laid out, cotton or linen beneath layers of wool and heavier fabrics. Each piece is a barrier between your skin and the outside world. You are about to encase yourself in multiple layers of clothing, each one adding bulk and weight. By the time you are fully dressed, you will feel considerably heavier and less mobile than you do now in your nightclothes. This is simply the accepted state of being dressed in the Victorian era. The corset, if you are a woman, is a particular challenge. It is not the glamorous object of modern fantasy. It is a rigid, stiff piece of engineering, constructed with whalebone, steel, or wood, laced tightly across the torso. The purpose is not primarily to create a particular silhouette, though that is part of it. The primary purpose is to provide back support and maintain posture. However, the side effect is a significant compression of the internal organs, restricted breathing, and a constant awareness of the garment's presence against your body. If you are a man, you face your own challenges. Your trousers are structured, stiff when new. Your shirt collar is high and rigid, fastened with stud buttons that require significant finger strength to manipulate. Your waistcoat restricts movement. Your jacket sits heavily on your shoulders. By modern standards, fully dressing is an ordeal. And remember, you are about to spend the entire day and most of the evening in these clothes without the possibility of changing or removing any significant portion of them until nightfall. Once dressed, you must leave your bedroom and descend the stairs. The staircase is your first real navigation challenge of the day. It is steep by modern standards. The Victorian era had different building codes and different ideas about what was acceptable. The stairs are wooden, and they creak. Each step is narrow and deep. You hold onto the banister, which is dark wood, cool to the touch. As you descend, you move into the central parts of the house. The temperature is rising slightly. The communal areas are warmer than the bedrooms, though still far from what a modern person would consider comfortable. The house smells of several things simultaneously: old wood, the faint residue of last night's fires, the ever-present smell of the gas lights, if you have them, and the accumulated sense of the household itself, cooking from previous days, furniture polish, the slight mustiness of old fabric and paper. The hallways are narrower than you might expect. Modern homes, designed with open-concept living in mind, feel expansive. Victorian homes are more compartmentalized. Walls divide the space into specific rooms, each with a specific function, and the connecting hallways are passages rather than living spaces. The effect is somewhat confining. You are always moving through defined corridors from one chamber to another, never having the sense of flowing open space. You arrive at the breakfast room. This is not the kitchen, that is a separate domain, located at the back or basement of the house. The kitchen is the realm of servants, and it is not a place where you, as a member of the household family, would typically venture. Instead, the kitchen's products, prepared food, hot water, cleaned items, flow to you through a system of bells, servants, and carefully maintained hierarchies. The breakfast room is marginally warmer than the rest of the house because a fire has been lit in the hearth. This fire has been burning since early morning. It was started by servants who rose before dawn to prepare the household for the day. This is perhaps the first moment you should pause and truly consider. Before you woke, others had already been awake for hours, working in cold kitchens and dim hallways by candlelight, hauling water, chopping wood, and performing dozens of tasks necessary for you to wake to even this modest level of comfort. The breakfast table is set with the various items considered appropriate for a morning meal. Cold meats, perhaps, bread, butter, preserves, eggs. There is tea or coffee, which is hot and therefore precious. You sit down at the table, and you notice several things almost immediately. The chair is wooden with a hard seat. There is no cushioning. If you remain seated for more than a few minutes, you become conscious of this hardness. The table itself is also wooden and somewhat sticky, not dirty necessarily, but the accumulated residue of thousands of meals creates a slightly tacky surface. The cutlery is heavy, requiring more effort to manipulate than modern silverware. Each bite of food requires deliberate movement and conscious effort. The room is dim despite the morning hour. The windows, while no longer heavily curtained, are small and set high in the walls. The light they admit is weak and gray, particularly if the weather is overcast, which in Victorian-era Britain it often is. You eat breakfast in a room that feels somewhat twilight-like, even though it is mid-morning. As the morning progresses, you become aware of the rhythm of the household. Tasks are performed at specific times. The servants are constantly moving, constantly working. The fires must be maintained. The water must be heated. The floors must be swept. The laundry must be done. Each of these tasks is labor-intensive and time-consuming. What a modern household accomplishes in an hour, a Victorian household might accomplish in a day. And you, as a member of the household, begin to understand that you cannot simply rest or pursue leisure at will. There are obligations, calls to make, letters to write, social necessities to observe. You are not imprisoned exactly, but you are bound by expectations and routines that are as rigorous, in their way, as any workplace schedule. By mid-afternoon you are struck by something unexpected. You need to use the toilet. In a modern home, this is a trivial matter. Walk to the bathroom, perform the necessary actions, and return. In a Victorian home, it is a considerably more complex undertaking. If you are fortunate, you have indoor plumbing. But even indoor plumbing in the Victorian era is not like modern plumbing. The toilet itself is a separate room, often quite cold, certainly drafty. The seat is not cushioned. The experience is not one of comfort or privacy in the modern sense. You are sitting in a cold room, performing a necessary biological function, aware of every physical sensation, the cold seat, the draft from gaps in the structure, the basic discomfort of the setup. If you are less fortunate, you must use an outhouse, or even a chamber pot that must be emptied by a servant. This is worse in almost every way imaginable, and the simple act of using the toilet has taken you away from the warmth of the fire, away from your activities, and deposited you in a place of profound discomfort. You are learning, gradually, that comfort in the Victorian home is fragile and localized. It exists only in certain places, at certain times, in the vicinity of a fire or a loved one. Everywhere else, you are managing discomfort. By late afternoon, you are accumulating a series of physical sensations that are beginning to wear on you. Your skin, under all those layers of clothing, is warm but not in a pleasant way. You are not sweating exactly. The layers of fabric wick away moisture, but you are conscious of the weight of the clothing, the restriction of movement, and the way the layers create a barrier between you and the air. Your corset, if you wear one, is a constant presence. It has not loosened or adjusted to your body. If anything, you've become more aware of it as the day has progressed. Your breathing is slightly restricted, and while you've adapted to this enough to function normally, you are aware that you could not exert yourself too much without feeling dizzy or breathless. Your hands and face, having been washed only this morning, are now beginning to feel less fresh. There is no way to wash again without undertaking the full ritual. You are aware that your hands have accumulated the dust of handling papers, the slight residue of various tasks, the general grime of a day indoors in a world without modern cleaning standards. The light is fading. Gas lamps, if available, can be lit, but they require the services of a servant to light them, and they emit both heat and a particular smell that, over time, becomes noticeable. The alternative is candlelight, which is dim and casts wavering shadows. You are beginning to understand that the Victorian day is a series of small discomforts, none of them individually catastrophic, but cumulatively significant. It is not that any one thing is unbearable. It is that everything, all at once, requires adjustment and acceptance. As evening approaches, you are offered the luxury of another washing. Perhaps this time the water is lukewarm at best. Your face and hands are washed again, and briefly you feel more refreshed. But the effect is temporary. Dinner is being prepared. The smells from the kitchen are beginning to permeate the house, cooking meat, boiling vegetables, the acrid smell of the range where food is prepared. These smells, overlaid on everything else, create a particular sensory environment that is distinctly Victorian, lived in, active, but not particularly pleasant. You are tired, though you have not exerted yourself physically in any significant way, but the accumulation of small discomforts, the awareness of cold in certain areas, the restriction of movement, the dim light that is required, your eyes to adjust and readjust throughout the day, all of this has created a subtle exhaustion, and you realize, with a kind of dawning comprehension, that this day has only been a single day. You have perhaps 6 more hours before you can retreat to your cold bedroom, remove these restrictive clothes, and seek the refuge of sleep. And then tomorrow, you will wake and do it all again. This is the rhythm of Victorian life. Not dramatic, not exciting, but fundamentally, profoundly demanding in ways that your modern body and expectations are entirely unprepared for. Let us pause for a moment in this present discomfort you are experiencing and step backward into history. Today, you have been living as a Victorian for less than a full day. But imagine now that this is not a temporary experiment. Imagine that you were born into this world in the year 1850, that you have never known anything else, that every comfort and discomfort you have experienced today would be, to you, simply the natural state of existence. This is the story we must tell now. Not of you, a modern person displaced in time, but of a person born into the Victorian era, and we shall follow this person across the full arc of their Victorian life, from childhood through old age. In doing so, we will understand not merely what was uncomfortable about Victorian life, but how people adapted to it, how they came to accept it, and how those adaptations shaped every aspect of their existence. Let us begin with our subject's birth. We will call her Margaret, though millions of Margarets lived during this era, each one experiencing variation of the same themes. Margaret was born in 1845 in a middle-class household in Manchester. Her father was a mill owner, not wealthy by the standards of the industrial magnates of the era, but secure and respectable. Her mother came from a family of merchants. This means Margaret was born into a world of certain privileges, but also of rigid expectations and careful social positioning. Margaret's childhood was spent in a large house not unlike the one you found yourself in this morning. She had a nursery room, a space separate from the rest of the household where children were kept during the day, tended by a nursemaid. This nursery was not a place of free play and self-expression as a modern child's room might be. It was a place of instruction, routine, and the careful cultivation of proper behavior. From her earliest years, Margaret learned that her body had rules. Girls of her class wore corsets even as children, not the severe, rigid corsets of adult women, but structured garments nonetheless that taught her, from childhood, that her natural body shape was something to be constrained and controlled. She learned to sit properly, to walk with a particular bearing, to restrict her movements. These were not conscious lessons, necessarily. They were learned through imitation and gentle correction. Her education was different from that of her brothers. While her brothers were sent away to school, a traumatic experience in itself, involving separation from family and harsh discipline, Margaret was educated at home by a governess. The governess was a woman of precarious social standing, neither quite a servant nor quite a member of the family, and Margaret's education reflected this ambiguity. She learned French and a little Italian, enough drawing to be considered accomplished but not so much as to aspire to be an artist, enough music to play the pianoforte at social gatherings, but not enough to be a professional musician. The goal was not to develop her intellect or passions, but to make her into a suitable companion for a future husband and a capable hostess. By the time Margaret was 12 years old, she had fully internalized the constraints of her gender and her class. She did not find them oppressive, because she had never known anything else. They were the natural order of the world. She understood, without being explicitly told, what was expected of her: obedience, propriety, the cultivation of a pleasant appearance, and the eventual acceptance of marriage as her primary life event. Margaret's adolescence was marked by a gradual awareness that her future was being constructed around her. Her father's business interests expanded and contracted with the economic cycles of the industrial age. The 1850s and 1860s were years of relative prosperity. The family traveled occasionally, not to distant lands, but to established resort towns and to the homes of relatives. Margaret, dressed in increasingly elaborate clothing befitting her gender and class, was presented in these contexts as a young woman of marriageable age. Marriage, during the Victorian era, was the central event of a woman's life. It was not a romantic adventure as it might be conceived of today, though romance could certainly be present. It was a legal and economic transaction, negotiated carefully between families, with the goal of establishing advantageous alliances and ensuring the secure future of the woman in question. Margaret's own preferences mattered, but only insofar as she could refuse a prospect that was deemed unsuitable. And even this refusal came with social costs. The constant awareness of being evaluated, of being presented, of knowing that her future depended on whether a suitable gentleman took an interest in her, created a particular kind of psychological pressure. Margaret learned to monitor her appearance constantly. Was her hair arranged properly? Was her dress appropriate for this occasion? Was her posture correct? Was her conversation engaging but not too forward? Was she demonstrating the proper mixture of accomplishment and modesty? By her late teens, Margaret was experiencing a kind of exhaustion that she would have been unable to articulate. It was not the exhaustion of labor, she did not work, but the exhaustion of constant performance, constant vigilance, constant awareness of being observed and evaluated. In 1865, at the age of 20, Margaret married William. He was 28, the son of a respectable family engaged in textile trading. The marriage was considered a good match by both families. Margaret felt a mixture of emotions on her wedding day: relief that the uncertainty was over, anxiety about what marriage would entail, and a dutiful acceptance of her new role. William, too, had been shaped by his era and his class. He had grown up with servants, with the expectation that his comfort was the responsibility of others, with the assumption that the world was ordered for his benefit and participation. He was not deliberately cruel or particularly unkind, but he was, fundamentally, self-centered in a way that was simply normal for a man of his era. His needs came first. His comfort was paramount. His wife's primary role was to facilitate his comfort and to provide him with heirs. The marriage was consummated, which for Margaret was likely an uncomfortable and confusing experience. She had been given no real preparation for sexual relations, and the sudden introduction to her husband's body and his sexual needs was a shock to her system. But this, too, was simply expected. It was part of marriage, and within a year, Margaret was pregnant. Pregnancy and childbirth marked a transformation in Margaret's life. Pregnancy itself was a hidden affair. She was not displayed in public once her condition became obvious. She withdrew from social life, spending her days in the home, growing increasingly uncomfortable as her body transformed. The corset had to be adjusted, and by the final months of pregnancy, she was essentially confined to the house, waiting for the ordeal of childbirth. Childbirth in the 1860s was dangerous. Infection, complications, and hemorrhage killed significant numbers of women every year. Margaret was fortunate. Her labor lasted approximately 18 hours, was attended by a doctor and nurse, and resulted in a healthy daughter. But the experience was traumatic. She spent several weeks in bed recovering, during which time her newborn daughter was primarily cared for by a nurse. This was the expected arrangement. Mothers of Margaret's class did not personally attend to the constant, demanding needs of infants. That was the work of servants. Over the next 15 years, Margaret bore 4 more children, 3 more daughters, and finally a son. With each pregnancy, she experienced the same pattern: withdrawal from society, the discomfort of carrying pregnancy through the heat of summer or the cold of winter, the danger and pain of childbirth, and the exhaustion of recovery. Between pregnancies, she managed her household, directed the servants, made social calls, and maintained her position in her community. Her body, during these years, was constantly in a state of transformation. She was recovering from one pregnancy while beginning another. Her abdominal muscles, stretched repeatedly, never fully returned to their previous state. She developed various complaints that her doctor attributed to her female constitution: back pain, headaches, a general sense of fatigue. That these complaints might be connected to repeated pregnancies, the constant wearing of restrictive corsets, the poor air quality in the house, or the fundamental stress of her existence, did not occur to the medical understanding of the era. By her mid-40s, Margaret had settled into a kind of resigned acceptance of her life. The intensity of early marriage had diminished. William maintained a mistress, which was an open secret in their social circle, and considered a normal part of a gentleman's life. Margaret was not pleased by this arrangement, but it was not a source of active conflict. It simply was. She had her children, her household, her social position. These were the compensations for her marriage. Her daughters were being raised much as she had been raised, with the same combination of privilege and constraint. The youngest daughter showed signs of being clever, perhaps too clever. Margaret found herself worrying that her daughter's intellectual ambitions might make her unmarriageable, and so she gently discouraged the study of serious subjects. Her son was prepared for school, for university, for a position in the family business or the civil service. His future was open in ways that his sister's futures were not. Margaret's body in middle age was beginning to show the accumulated toll of her years. Her hair, which had once been thick and lustrous, was thinning. Her skin, always carefully protected from the sun, had nonetheless developed a texture that seemed to her unfamiliar and unwelcome. Her waist, despite years of corseting, had thickened slightly. She began to experience what her doctor called the change, the onset of menopause. This was viewed, in medical literature of the era, as a nervous condition, a kind of temporary insanity that affected many women. She was prescribed rest, tonics, and the suggestion that she cease any strenuous intellectual or physical activity. By the 1890s, Margaret was in her later 50s. The Victorian era was beginning to change. New technologies were appearing: electric lighting in some homes, the telephone, the ability to travel greater distances more quickly. But these changes happened slowly for people of Margaret's generation. She adapted to them gradually when they appeared in her household, but they did not fundamentally change the rhythms of her life. She had become, in her way, a matriarch. Her daughters were either married or approaching spinsterhood. Her son was established in business. She was, in the language of the era, a respectable woman of a certain age. The constraints that had once bound her so tightly had loosened somewhat. She could wear less restrictive clothing, she could move through the world with more authority, and less anxiety about her appearance or eligibility. In exchange, she had become somewhat invisible. She was no longer evaluated as a potential romantic partner. She had moved into a different category of existence. She spent her time managing her household, corresponding with her children, attending to her various charitable obligations, and gradually preparing for her eventual death. She had accepted, somewhere along the way, that her life was not going to contain grand romance or personal achievement. She had accepted that her primary value had been in her reproductive capacity and her maintenance of household order. She had accepted that her emotional needs and intellectual desires were secondary to her duties. This was not a conscious, resentful acceptance in most cases. It was a deep, fundamental integration of her society's expectations into her own understanding of what was right and proper. When Margaret reflected on her life, she likely felt a mixture of resignation and quiet satisfaction. She had done what was expected of her. She had maintained propriety. She had produced children and grandchildren. She had not scandalized her family. By the standards of her era, she had lived a successful life. And here is the peculiar genius of the Victorian era, and indeed of many historical periods. It normalized discomfort and constraint to such a degree that people could live their entire lives within these systems without feeling fundamentally oppressed by them. Margaret never had a moment of liberation, never made a choice that was entirely her own, never pursued a passion that was simply for her own satisfaction. But she also did not, throughout her life, believe that this was fundamentally wrong or unjust. It was simply how the world was ordered. When Margaret eventually died, in 1912, at the age of 67, she left behind a household and family organized according to Victorian principles that she had internalized so thoroughly that they seemed to her to be natural law rather than social construction. This is the human reality of historical periods. They are not experienced by the people living within them as oppressive or strange or difficult in any absolute sense. They are simply the conditions of existence. And by the time a person becomes conscious enough to question those conditions, they have often internalized them so thoroughly that the idea of anything else seems impossible or wrong. You, in your one day in the Victorian household, have the luxury of experiencing the discomfort as discomfort, of recognizing the constraints as constraints, of knowing that they are temporary and that another way of living exists. But Margaret, who lived an entire lifetime in this world, had no such reference point. She knew only what she had always known, and she adapted to it the way human beings adapt to nearly everything, gradually, thoroughly, and ultimately accepting it as normal. We have spent considerable time now in the main rooms of the Victorian household, experiencing the discomforts of daily life from the perspective of someone of means and leisure. But we have done so while remaining largely blind to the reality that made this household function at all. It is time now to turn our attention downward, in a sense, to the people whose labor made the comforts you experience possible, the servants. The servant class during the Victorian era was vast. In a household of moderate means, there might be anywhere from 5 to 15 servants, depending on the size of the household and its financial circumstances. In a wealthy household, the number could be much larger. These servants were almost entirely invisible to the people they served, not through any particular malice, but through a systematic arrangement of space and time that kept them mostly out of sight. Imagine, if you will, the household as a kind of theater with two sets. The front stage, where you have been conducting your day, consists of the drawing rooms, dining room, hallways, and bedrooms. These are spaces designed for visibility, for comfort, for the display of wealth and status. But behind this front stage, often quite literally behind doors and down separate staircases, exists the backstage, the kitchen, the scullery, the servants' quarters, the laundry rooms. The kitchen of a Victorian household of any size was a complex, almost industrial operation. It was typically located either in the basement or at the back of the house, as far away as possible from the main living spaces, partly for convenience in terms of bringing in fuel and disposing of refuse, but also to keep the smell, heat, and noise of cooking separate from the refined atmosphere of the family's living spaces. The cook, almost always a woman of a certain age and considerable skill, was the undisputed authority in the kitchen. She had trained for years, often beginning as a scullery maid and working her way up through various kitchen positions. Her knowledge was vast and specialized. She understood the properties of different meats and vegetables, how to make stocks and sauces from scraps, how to time multiple dishes so they were all ready at the same moment, how to stretch limited resources to feed a household of 20 or more people daily. Her authority in the kitchen was absolute, and her mood had a significant impact on the quality of life for everyone below her. A kind cook might ensure that the kitchen servants ate decently. A harsh cook might make their lives miserable. She managed a hierarchy of people, the kitchen maid, the scullery maid, perhaps a second cook if the household was large. And she was, in her way, as trapped by the Victorian system as any society lady, though in different ways. Let us descend further now into the scullery, that most oppressive of Victorian domestic spaces. The scullery maid was typically the lowest-ranking servant in a household, often a young girl, sometimes as young as 10 or 11 years old. The scullery was the place where the dishes from the entire household's meals were washed. Not just the dishes, but the pots, pans, and implements used in cooking. Not just washed, but scoured until they gleamed, using sand and brick dust and increasingly caustic soaps. The work was done in cold water. Hot water was precious and reserved for cooking and cleaning the family's bodies. The scullery maid stood for hours, sometimes 9 to 10 hours a day, submerged in freezing water, her hands becoming raw and cracked, developing what was known as scullery hands, a chronic condition characterized by roughness, bleeding, and permanent changes to the skin texture. The scullery was also typically damp, poorly lit, and inadequately ventilated. Mold grew on the walls. The smell, a combination of rotting food particles, mold, caustic soap, and human waste from the nearby privy, was overwhelming to anyone accustomed to fresh air. The scullery maid breathed this air for hours every day. She developed persistent coughs, skin conditions, and a general pallor from lack of sunlight. This, it should be noted, was not considered cruel. This was simply how kitchens functioned. The work had to be done, and someone had to do it. The fact that it was done by a child, often working through the night if there had been a dinner party, was simply accepted as the natural order of things. Equally demanding and equally invisible was the work of laundry. In the Victorian household, laundry was an enormous undertaking. The volume of cloth that required washing was staggering. Sheets, pillowcases, towels, undergarments, handkerchiefs, aprons, the outer clothes that could occasionally be washed. All of this had to be managed by hand. The laundry typically occupied a separate building or a room set apart from the main house because the process was wet, steamy, and involved considerable physical labor and heat. A laundress, often aided by several assistants, would begin the work early in the morning. Water had to be heated, enormous quantities of it. Clothes had to be sorted, soaked, scrubbed against washboards, wrung out by hand, and rinsed multiple times. The wringing was particularly grueling work. The cloth, heavy with water, had to be twisted by hand or with a wringer device that required considerable strength to operate. Injuries were common. Hands caught in the mechanism, fingers crushed, muscles strained. The laundress's arms and shoulders developed enormous strength, but also chronic pain. Once washed and wrung, the clothes had to be hung to dry. If the weather was favorable, they were dried outdoors. If not, they were dried indoors in the laundry room or in the kitchen. Drying indoors increased the humidity of the space, encouraged mold growth, and made the work slower. The entire process could take days for a large household, and when the clothes were finally dry, they had to be ironed. Ironing in the Victorian era was also a labor-intensive process. The irons themselves, flat metal implements, had to be heated on the stove. A test had to be performed to determine if the iron was the right temperature. Too hot and it would scorch the fabric, too cool and it wouldn't press effectively. The ironer worked methodically through enormous stacks of fabric, her arms and shoulders perpetually warm, often uncomfortably so. Yet she worked in the laundry room which, despite the heat of the irons, was rarely truly warm. A woman might spend an entire day, from dawn to dusk, ironing. If she was working on delicate items, lace, fine linens, complicated garments, the work required intense concentration. A moment of inattention could result in a ruined piece of fabric, which would reflect poorly on the laundress's reputation and competence. While the scullery and laundry worked on specific tasks, the housemaid, or housemaids, plural if there was more than one, managed the general cleanliness of the house. This was an endless task. Every room had to be dusted, every floor had to be swept or scrubbed, every window had to be cleaned, every surface had to be maintained. The dirt was constant and overwhelming. The Victorian house, with its gas lamps and fires, generated soot and smoke that settled on every surface. The street outside was unpaved or cobblestoned, without modern traffic controls, and horses, the primary means of transportation, generated enormous quantities of manure that dried, broke apart, and became dust that was carried into the house on people's clothes and shoes. The dust was not merely unpleasant, it carried with it bacteria and microorganisms that contributed to the diseases that killed so many Victorians. The housemaid's day began before dawn. She had to clean out the previous day's ashes from the fireplaces and lay new fires. This work, removing cold, sooty ash and arranging kindling and coal, left her covered in black dust and soot. Her hands became permanently stained. Then she had to sweep the floors, dust the furniture, wash the windows, and maintain some semblance of order throughout the house. The work was physically demanding, and the conditions were difficult. The housemaid worked in cold, drafty hallways. Her hands were constantly wet and cold from washing, becoming chapped and painful. Her back ached from bending and reaching. Her knees ached from kneeling to scrub floors. And the moment she had cleaned a room, someone would enter it and begin the slow process of making it dirty again. In wealthier households, there was the lady's maid, a woman of slightly higher status than the housemaid, who was responsible for the personal appearance and needs of the mistress of the house. This work had a different character. The lady's maid was intimate with her employer's body in ways that other servants were not. She helped her dress, managed her hair, knew the details of her physical vulnerabilities and vanities. The lady's maid had to understand the complex requirements of Victorian fashion. She had to be able to tighten corsets to the precise degree her employer desired. She had to arrange hair into elaborate styles that required considerable skill and patience. She had to manage the many buttons, hooks, and fastenings that kept Victorian clothing together. She had to understand the subtle gradations of which garments were appropriate for which occasions. This work, while less physically arduous than scrubbing or ironing, was taxing in different ways. The lady's maid had to be attentive, observant, and responsive to her employer's moods and needs. She had to maintain a careful distance while being intimately involved in the details of her employer's life. She knew secrets, the extent to which her employer's figure departed from the ideal that her corsets created, the specific nature of her employer's physical complaints and vulnerabilities, the details of her employer's intimate life. Outside the house, or in specific rooms of the house, were the male servants. The butler, in a wealthy household, was the highest-ranking male servant and managed the other male servants and coordinated with the female servants through the housekeeper. The footman was responsible for heavy work, carrying supplies, maintaining the grounds, serving at table. The coachman managed the horses and carriages. These men, too, were bound by rigid hierarchies and expectations. The butler's appearance had to be impeccable. He wore a specific uniform. His deportment had to be correct. His manner had to reflect deference while maintaining authority over the other servants. The footman, if employed in a wealthy household, was often chosen for his appearance. Tall, well-formed young men, whose visual appeal was part of their job description. They were expected to stand for hours without complaint, to serve at table without being noticed, to accomplish their tasks with an almost invisible efficiency. What is crucial to understand about Victorian servants is that they comprised an enormous hidden workforce that made the entire system function. Without them, the comfort experienced by the people upstairs would be impossible. The tea that was hot when you awoke required servants to wake in the dark, start fires, heat water, and bring it to you. The meals you ate required servants to shop, to prepare, to cook, and to clean afterward. The clean clothes you wore required servants to wash, dry, and iron them. The fires that provided heat required servants to haul coal and lay fires. The floors you walked on required servants to sweep and scrub them. And perhaps most importantly, the ignorance you maintained, the fact that you could exist in a state of comfort without constantly being aware of all the labor that made that comfort possible, required servants to remain invisible, to move through the house at times when the family was not present, to accomplish their work in spaces designated for them, to exist in a separate world that overlapped with but remained fundamentally separate from the world of those they served. We know about Victorian servants not merely from written records, but from archaeological evidence. Excavations of Victorian domestic sites reveal dishes with distinct patterns, elaborate designs for the family's meals, plain utilitarian designs for the servants' meals. They reveal separate staircases, separate doors, separate spaces. They reveal the material traces of work, worn stone in the kitchen floor from decades of standing and walking, marks on walls from furniture repeatedly moved for cleaning, the outlines of rooms that no longer exist but that once contained the machinery of Victorian domestic life. We find, In historical records and letters, occasional glimpses of the servants themselves, a housemaid's diary, if she was one of the rare ones who could write and chose to record her thoughts, revealed a life of relentless work punctuated by occasional moments of rest or joy. A letter from a country lady to her friend, describing a new servant, revealed the judgments and expectations placed on these women and men. Records of illness and death show that servants died at higher rates than those of their employers, succumbing to the diseases that flourished in damp, cold, poorly lit rooms. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Victorian servant life is the question of how they experienced it psychologically. There are relatively few first-person accounts from servants. Most of what we know comes from external observations or records kept by those above them. Some servants, it appears, internalize the hierarchy as natural and right. They took pride in their work, in doing it well, in maintaining the household. Others harbored resentment that could occasionally bubble to the surface in moments of conflict or change. Some formed close bonds with those they served. Some maintained a carefully professional distance. Some worked from year to year hoping for something better. Perhaps a position in a different household, perhaps eventually leaving service altogether. The work was utterly demanding, the compensation was modest, and the conditions were often harsh. Yet people did this work, generation after generation, because the alternative was often worse. Unemployment, the poorhouse, destitution. Servants were not enslaved in the legal sense, but they had limited options and limited autonomy. They were bound by employment contracts, subject to dismissal without reference, and vulnerable to the whims of those who employed them. Understanding Victorian servants is essential to understanding Victorian culture as a whole. The entire aesthetic of the Victorian home, its comfort, its cleanliness, its order, was predicated on invisible labor. The books that were read, the music that was played, the leisure time that was enjoyed, all of this was enabled by the constant, exhausting work of servants. Moreover, the existence of servants had a profound impact on Victorian ideology. It reinforced ideas about natural hierarchies, about appropriate gender roles, about who was suited for intellectual work and who for manual labor. The comfort of the Victorian middle and upper classes was not merely physical, it was also psychological and ideological. It allowed them to believe that their position was natural, that their comfort was deserved, that those who worked for them were suited to their role. The servants, meanwhile, existed in a world of paradox. They were essential to Victorian life, yet were regarded as inferior. They were intimate with the family's secrets and vulnerabilities, yet were expected to maintain invisibility and discretion. They worked in the same house as those they served, yet inhabited completely different spaces, and lived by completely different rules. This hidden world, the world of servants, represents one of the great invisible structures of Victorian life. It is easy to imagine yourself in the drawing room of a Victorian house. Uncomfortable though you would be, it is harder to imagine yourself in the scullery or the laundry, and this difficulty in imagining is itself part of the point. The Victorian system depended on that invisibility, on that separation, on the ability of those with privilege to ignore or forget the constant labor that made their privilege possible. We have now spent considerable time in the middle reaches of Victorian society, in the home of a moderately prosperous mill owner's family, with sufficient servants to manage the household, sufficient means to maintain respectability, and sufficient comfort to make existence bearable, if not pleasant. But the Victorian era was not a monolithic experience. The conditions of life varied profoundly depending on one's position in the social hierarchy, and it is essential now to understand how different those lives truly were. Let us return for a moment to where you left off in that morning you spent in the Victorian house. Evening is approaching. We said that by evening you would be exhausted, though you had not labored. We noted that the fires were beginning to be lit in the main rooms, that gas lamps might be illuminated, that dinner was being prepared. But let us now expand our view and consider what was happening at that same moment in other parts of Victorian society. In the great houses of the English aristocracy, evening was also approaching, but the experience was different in profound ways. The aristocratic home might be vast, containing dozens of rooms, several hundred servants, grounds that extended for miles. The comfort available to an aristocratic family was greater than anything available to the middle classes, and yet, paradoxically, the constraints and obligations were also greater. A member of the aristocracy, particularly a woman, was bound by even more rigid social protocols than the middle-class women we have discussed. She could not simply rest or pursue leisure as she pleased. Her time was heavily structured by social obligations. She must attend certain events, must maintain certain appearances, must manage her social position with extreme care. An aristocratic woman's day might include morning correspondence, formal calls on other aristocratic women, an elaborate lunch, preparations for dinner, the dinner itself, and afterward an evening of entertainment or social engagement. The aristocratic home, despite its size and grandeur, was also bitterly cold in many of its rooms. Heating such vast spaces was impossible, and so large portions of aristocratic houses were simply abandoned to the cold during winter months. The family retreated to smaller, heated rooms, and servants were tasked with maintaining the appearance of the grand rooms, even though no one used them. The meals in an aristocratic household were elaborate, complex affairs requiring the coordination of multiple kitchens and many servants. An aristocratic dinner might consist of 10 or 12 courses: soup, fish, a meat course, a game course, vegetables, a sweet, cheeses, fruits, and various other items, each with its appropriate wine. The meal might last several hours. The guests would dress in formal attire: an aristocratic woman in an elaborate evening gown, an aristocratic man in evening dress with specific insignia of rank. And yet, despite all this display and elaboration, there was a peculiar emptiness at the heart of it. The aristocracy was not engaged in productive labor. Its members did not create anything or produce anything. Their entire existence was consumed by the maintenance of status and the performance of leisure. An aristocratic day, particularly for an aristocratic woman, could be remarkably empty of genuine meaning or purpose, filled instead with the constant performance of refinement and the management of one's social position. While an aristocratic woman was struggling with the ennui of a day consumed by social obligation, elsewhere in the city, an entirely different drama was unfolding. The urban working class, factory workers, laborers, those employed in domestic service, the unemployed and desperate, experienced the evening approaching with different concerns entirely. If you were a factory worker in an industrial city during the 1880s or 1890s, your day had likely begun before dawn. You rose in a cramped, cold room in a boarding house or tenement. The room you shared with one or more other people was poorly lit, poorly ventilated, and damp. You dressed in the clothes you had worn the day before. There was no laundry service for working-class people. You ate a quick breakfast of bread and perhaps tea, then walked to the factory. The factory itself was a kind of controlled hell. It was loud, the sound of machinery was overwhelming and constant. It was hot in some areas, cold in others, and filled with the smell of oil, metal, and human sweat. The machinery was dangerous, with exposed gears and sharp edges. Injuries were common and often catastrophic. Workers who lost fingers, hands, or limbs to machinery were simply dismissed. There was no compensation, no medical care, no acknowledgement that the injury had occurred in service to the factory's production. The work was repetitive and numbing. You might perform the same action hundreds of times a day, for hours without rest. Child labor was common. Children as young as 5 or 6 working alongside adults, their small hands and bodies suited to certain tasks, their wages even lower than those of adults. The workday could last 12, 13, or 14 hours. There were no standard breaks. You relieved yourself in poorly maintained latrines. You drank water of questionable quality from communal sources. By the time evening approached, you were exhausted in a way that bore no resemblance to the subtle exhaustion of the middle-class person in their drawing room. Your body ached. Your hands might be injured or bleeding. Your lungs might be clogged with dust or fiber from the factory environment. Your mind was numb from the repetitive nature of the work. You returned to your lodging. If you were fortunate, there was a meal waiting, a simple stew or bread and cheese, You might spend an hour or two in the common room with others, or you might simply collapse into your bed. There were no gas lamps in your room, no fire. You slept in cold and darkness, knowing that tomorrow you would wake and do it all again. But the experience of the working class was varied. If you were fortunate enough to have stable employment in a factory or trade, you at least had structure and predictability, however brutal. But if you were among the urban poor, the unemployed, the underemployed, those without steady work, your evening was marked by a different kind of desperation. The Victorian era was a time of enormous wealth accumulation, but it was also a time of severe poverty and economic uncertainty. Industrial cities swelled with migrants from the countryside and immigrants from other countries, all seeking work. The supply of labor far exceeded the demand, and wages were kept low by this abundance of desperate workers. If you lost your job, there were 100 other people ready to take it. If you were among the poor, you might live in a tenement, a building subdivided into small rooms, each one housing a family or multiple families. These tenements were overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through these environments. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid. These were constant threats. The infant mortality rate in poor urban areas was staggering. A child born in a tenement had perhaps a 30 or 40% chance of surviving to age 5. Your evening, if you were among the poor without steady employment, was spent in the company of desperation. You might be in a public house, drinking cheap beer to forget your circumstances. You might be searching for any small job that could bring in a few pennies, unloading ships, collecting refuse, any temporary work. You might be committing petty crimes out of necessity. You might be ill, with no means to pay for medical care, simply enduring your illness in the cold and darkness of your room. The contrast between the world of the aristocracy and the world of the urban poor was almost incomprehensible. They inhabited the same cities, but they might as well have been on different planets. They had no understanding of each other's experiences, no meaningful way to communicate or connect. Beyond the cities, in the countryside, existed yet another form of Victorian life, that of the agricultural laborer. If you were a farm laborer in the 1880s, your life was governed by the seasons in ways that urban workers' lives were not. During planting season and harvest, the work was relentless. You rose before dawn and worked until darkness fell. The work was physically demanding, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting. Your hands became thick with calluses, your back ached from bending. Your feet, in poorly made boots, developed blisters that often became infected. The compensation for this work was minimal. You earned perhaps a shilling or two a day, and your employment might be seasonal. In winter, when there was less agricultural work, you might be without employment, and there was no unemployment insurance, no safety net of any kind. You survived, if you did, through whatever means you could manage. The countryside, in the Victorian era, was not picturesque or romantic, as it might appear in paintings or photographs. It was muddy, cold, and harsh. The agricultural village was often isolated, with limited access to medical care, limited education opportunities, limited options for any kind of advancement or escape from agricultural labor. And yet, in some ways, the rural laborer had advantages over the urban poor. There was often a small community, a sense of belonging, a connection to the land. The food, though simple, was often fresher than what was available in the cities. The air, though filled with the smell of manure and earth, was at least not filled with the toxic fumes of factories. We must not forget that within the middle class itself, there were significant gradations. If you were a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, a civil servant, your life was different from that of a mill owner or merchant. The professional class had education, status, and a certain degree of security, but also had a specific culture of their own. A professional man was expected to maintain a certain appearance and lifestyle, to belong to the right clubs, to maintain social connections, to display the markers of his education and status. A professional woman, particularly if unmarried, faced a precarious situation. She might have education but few opportunities to use it professionally, and was often expected to wait for marriage as her primary aspiration. A professional woman who remained unmarried had to navigate the social world as an anomaly, often retreating into spinsterhood, teaching, or charity work. The professional man's evening might be spent at his club, reading newspapers, discussing politics and business with other men of his class. There was a culture of intellectual engagement, of debate and discussion, that existed among the educated classes. This was a genuine advantage, access to ideas, to conversation, to the life of the mind, that was unavailable to those of lower classes. But the professional man was also bound by rigid expectations. He could not simply do as he pleased. His reputation was paramount. His wife had to be managed carefully, not too clever, not too independent, but accomplished and refined enough to serve as a proper hostess. His children had to be educated and directed toward appropriate careers. The appearance of success and propriety had to be constantly maintained. As we move toward the end of the Victorian era, we must acknowledge a phenomenon that was occurring in parallel with all of this: the emergence of women who rejected, at least partially, the constraints of their prescribed role. These women were still a minority, and their rebellion took different forms depending on their class and circumstances. Some middle-class and upper-class women, educated and frustrated by their limited opportunities, began to organize for reform. They argued for women's education, for women's property rights, and eventually, for women's suffrage. These women faced significant social opposition. They were deemed unnatural, dangerous, threatening to the social order. But they persisted, creating organizations, writing and publishing, organizing public events. Working-class women, in some cases, participated in labor organizing and socialist movements. They understood themselves as part of a class struggle, not merely as women struggling against male domination. Their concerns were more immediate: fair wages, reasonable working hours, safe conditions. The various feminisms of the Victorian era, and it is important to recognize that there were multiple forms of feminism, some more radical than others, represented a crack in the Victorian facade. They suggested that the constraints and expectations that everyone had accepted as natural were, in fact, constructed and could potentially be changed. One of the striking aspects of the Victorian era is the paradox of simultaneous acceptance and resistance. Most people accepted the social order as natural and inevitable, and yet there were always those who questioned it, who chafed against it, who sought ways to escape it or reform it. Working-class people formed unions and engaged in strikes, knowing that the authorities would often come with violence to suppress these movements. Political radicals distributed pamphlets and newspapers advocating for socialism or anarchism. Women organized for their rights, knowing they would be ridiculed and condemned. These resistance movements were often brutally suppressed. Strikes were broken by police or military force. Radical newspapers were shut down. Women's rights organizers faced arrest and imprisonment. And yet, people continued to resist, to organize, to argue for change. Perhaps this is one of the most important truths about historical periods. They are not monolithic. Even at the height of the Victorian era, even as most people accepted its constraints as natural, there were always those who questioned and resisted. The social order was not maintained merely by force, but also by the consent and acceptance of those within it. And that consent was never universal or complete. As evening fell across Victorian society, then, what was happening? In the great houses of the aristocracy, elaborate dinners were being prepared. In the middle-class homes, more modest meals were being served, and the family was settling in for an evening of limited entertainment, perhaps reading, perhaps music, perhaps simply conversation. In the tenements and slums, people were crowding into small rooms, trying to stay warm, trying to forget their circumstances, trying to survive another day. In rural areas, exhausted agricultural laborers were collapsing into sleep, and throughout all of these environments, in all of these social positions, people were managing the constraints and expectations of their lives. Some accepted these constraints as inevitable. Some resisted them. Most did some combination of both, accepting what they could not change, resisting where they could, adapting and surviving as human beings have always done. The Victorian era was not a single experience. It was millions of different experiences, shaped by class, by gender, by geography, by individual circumstance. What tied these experiences together was not uniformity, but a shared social structure, a shared set of assumptions about how the world should be ordered, and a shared recognition, explicit or implicit, that this order had to be maintained. Let us return now to you, the modern person who has spent a day in a Victorian house. You have experienced in these many hours a taste of what comfort meant in the Victorian era. You have felt the cold, the heavy clothing, the restriction of movement. You have experienced the accumulation of small discomforts, the awareness of the invisible labor that made your comfort possible. But you have also been insulated from the full reality of Victorian life. You have not worked in a factory for 14 hours. You have not lived in a tenement with a dozen people in 3 rooms. You have not experienced the desperate hunger of the urban poor or the exhaustion of agricultural labor. You have not spent your entire life, from childhood onward, in such circumstances. And yet, what you have experienced, the discomfort of the cold, the restriction of the clothing, the awareness of labor and hierarchy, is something that the vast majority of Victorians would have recognized. Whether you were middle class or working class, aristocratic or rural, you inhabited a world that was cold, that was hierarchical, that required constant labor and adaptation. The aristocracy had more comfort, but also more constraints and more emptiness. The working classes had less comfort, but, in some cases, more community and more meaningful labor. The poor had almost no comfort and faced desperation and disease, but all of them, experienced a world that was fundamentally different from our own. We have now journeyed through a full day in a Victorian household, through a lifetime of Victorian existence, and across the breadth of Victorian society. But there remains one crucial dimension of Victorian life that we have only touched upon: the physical body itself, and what happened when that body became ill. The Victorian era was a time of paradox in medical science. On one hand, great advances were being made. Germ theory was being developed and gradually accepted. Antiseptic and aseptic procedures were beginning to be understood and implemented. The microscope was revealing the invisible world of bacteria and microorganisms. And yet, much of medical practice remained rooted in older theories and approaches that were, by modern standards, entirely ineffective or actively harmful. The average Victorian physician was educated in anatomy, in the theory of humors, the belief that the body was governed by 4 basic substances that must remain in balance, and in a variety of treatments that ranged from the benign to the dangerous. He believed, often sincerely, that he was acting in his patient's best interest, but his treatments were frequently either useless or actively harmful. One of the most common treatments in Victorian medicine was bloodletting. Based on the theory of humors, doctors believed that many illnesses were caused by an excess of blood, and that removing blood would restore balance to the body. Patients would be bled by lancet or by the application of leeches. The amount of blood removed could be substantial, a pint or more. For a weak or already ill patient, the loss of blood often accelerated their decline rather than aiding their recovery. Another common treatment was the administration of mercury for syphilis. Mercury is a toxic substance, and while it did have some antibacterial properties that might provide partial relief of syphilitic symptoms, the toxicity of mercury often caused severe damage to the patient's kidneys, teeth, and nervous system. The phrase "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury" captured the grim reality of this treatment. Patients were also frequently given laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, for pain relief, for calming anxiety, for treating insomnia. Laudanum was widely available, not requiring a prescription, and was used for everything from teething pain in infants to chronic pain in adults. The result was widespread addiction. Many Victorians, without understanding what was happening to them, became dependent on laudanum, experiencing withdrawal symptoms if they attempted to stop using it. Purgatives, substances intended to cause bowel movements, were another common treatment. Based on the theory that many illnesses were caused by constipation or by the retention of toxic substances in the bowel, doctors prescribed powerful laxatives. These purgatives could cause severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, which could be fatal, particularly in patients who were already weakened by illness. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption or phthisis, was the leading cause of death during much of the Victorian era. It was a wasting disease that gradually destroyed the lungs, causing the patient to cough up blood, to become increasingly weak, and eventually to die, often after months or years of progressive decline. The treatment for tuberculosis, once it became clear that bloodletting and mercury were ineffective, evolved into the sanatorium cure. Patients were admitted to sanatoriums, institutions designed to treat tuberculosis through a combination of rest, fresh air, and good nutrition. The theory was that the disease was caused by weakness and poor living conditions, and that rest and recovery in a healthy environment would restore the patient to health. The sanatoriums were often located in mountainous regions or in areas with particularly pure air. Wealthy patients could afford private sanatoriums, which were comfortable and well appointed. Poorer patients went to public sanatoriums, which were often crowded and poorly maintained. The sanatorium experience was, for many patients, a period of waiting and hoping. Some did recover, perhaps because their immune systems were strong enough to overcome the infection, but many did not. They remained in the sanatorium, gradually wasting away until they died. Surgery in the Victorian era, particularly in the earlier part of the period, was an ordeal of almost unimaginable severity. Anesthesia was available, ether and chloroform were used, but the amount used had to be carefully calculated. Too little, and the patient would remain conscious during the surgery, experiencing excruciating pain. Too much, and the patient might die from the anesthetic itself. Even with anesthesia, surgery was traumatic. The surgeon worked quickly, knowing that speed was essential. A simple operation, removal of a kidney stone, amputation of a gangrenous limb, had to be completed in minutes. The patient's body was held down by assistants. The blood flowed freely. The smell of blood and burned tissue filled the operating theater. After surgery, the risk of infection was enormous. Antiseptic procedures were not universally practiced, and even when they were imperfect. Wound infections, often resulting in sepsis and death, were a common outcome of surgery. A patient who survived the surgery itself might still die days or weeks later from infection, and yet, despite these risks, patients submitted to surgery when necessary. The alternative, living with a kidney stone or dying slowly from gangrene, was worse than the risk of the surgical ordeal. Women's health, in Victorian medicine, was a particular area of confusion and harm. The Victorian medical establishment had strong ideas about women's bodies and women's nature. Women were believed to be fundamentally different from men, not merely in reproductive capacity, but in temperament, in intellect, in emotional stability. Menstruation was believed to be a weakening condition. Women were advised to rest during menstruation, to avoid strenuous activity, to protect themselves from shock or excitement. Pregnancy was treated as an illness requiring rest and confinement. Menopause was viewed as a nervous condition, almost a form of temporary insanity. The treatment of women's complaints often involved the removal of reproductive organs. A woman complaining of depression, of nervousness, of pain, might be advised to have her uterus removed or her ovaries removed. The surgery was often unnecessary and frequently made the patient's condition worse. Yet this was mainstream medical practice, recommended by respected physicians. Childbirth, though it was a natural process, was increasingly medicalized. Doctors began to attend births, which was a positive development in terms of having trained assistants present. But doctors, trained in surgery, often intervened unnecessarily. Forceps were used to speed delivery, sometimes causing damage to the baby or to the mother. Episiotomies, cuts made to enlarge the birth canal, became routine, often without clear medical necessity. Mental illness in the Victorian era was poorly understood and often brutally managed. Patients with severe mental illness were confined to asylums, institutions that were sometimes well-intentioned but often were simply warehouses for the unwanted and the disturbed. The treatments for mental illness ranged from the benign to the horrific. In some cases, patients were given rest, simple food, and gentle care. In other cases, they were subjected to various forms of shock treatment, cold water immersion, electric shocks, or medications that induced seizures. The theory behind these treatments was that shocking the system might reset the brain and restore normal function. In practice, these treatments often traumatized patients without providing any benefit. Restraint was common. Patients were confined to rooms, locked in straitjackets or other restraint devices. They were prevented from harming themselves or others, but they were also prevented from any meaningful activity or freedom of movement. Many patients spent years or decades in asylums, gradually deteriorating, eventually dying in institutional care. Mental illness that was minor or that could be managed at home was often hidden. Families were ashamed of mental illness in their members. Women who were depressed, anxious, or who displayed any deviation from the norm were sometimes simply confined to the home, their condition attributed to weakness or nervousness rather than to any genuine medical condition. For most Victorians, serious illness was a common occurrence. Infectious diseases, typhoid, cholera, influenza, pneumonia, swept through communities regularly, killing significant numbers of people. A minor infection could develop into sepsis and death. A broken bone, if it became infected, could lead to amputation or death. Childbirth could end in death. Pregnancy complications could be fatal. Appendicitis, which today is a routine surgical procedure, was often fatal because the symptoms were not understood, and by the time surgery was attempted, peritonitis had already set in. In the face of this reality, Victorians developed a particular relationship with illness and death. They were more familiar with death than modern people are. It was common for children to die. It was common for adults to die in the prime of life. The mortality rates were such that a significant proportion of the population had experienced the death of a close family member, a child, a sibling, a parent. The rituals around illness and death reflected this familiarity. A seriously ill person would be attended by family members. The deathbed was a significant event. The dying person's final words might be recorded and cherished. After death, there was an elaborate process of mourning. The family would wear black clothing for an extended period, would limit their social activities, would mark their loss in visible ways. Despite the existence of a medical establishment, many Victorians relied on folk remedies and traditional treatments. These remedies ranged from the innocuous to the dangerous. Some folk remedies actually worked. Willow bark contains salicin, which is similar to aspirin, and does have pain-relieving properties. Some were harmless placebos that provided comfort through the act of treatment. Some were actively harmful. Arsenic, for instance, was used in various preparations, often without the patient's knowledge. Mercury was not only used by physicians, but also in folk remedies. Lead compounds were used in cosmetics. The cumulative effect of exposure to these toxins contributed to various chronic illnesses. But folk remedies also represented a kind of agency in the face of illness. When the medical establishment offered bloodletting and mercury, a patient might choose instead to use a herbal remedy recommended by a family member or a wise woman in the community. This choice was not necessarily based on better medical understanding, but it represented an exercise of autonomy in the face of a medical system that was often ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. Healthcare in Victorian society was fundamentally unequal. The wealthy could afford to call a physician to their home. They could access the best available treatments, could afford medicines, could pay for surgery. They could go to a sanatorium if they developed tuberculosis. When they were ill, they were attended to in their own homes, with servants to care for them. The poor, by contrast, had limited access to medical care. If they could not afford a physician, they might rely on a local apothecary or healer. They might go to a charitable hospital or clinic, where they would be treated along with dozens of others in crowded, unsanitary conditions. They would continue to work, if possible, even while ill, because they could not afford to lose wages. If they became seriously ill, hospitalization meant separation from their family and from any source of income. This inequality in healthcare was one of the most direct manifestations of class difference in Victorian society. The wealthy had a better chance of surviving illness, of receiving treatment that might actually help, of dying at home surrounded by family rather than in an institutional setting. By the end of the Victorian era, medicine was beginning to change. Germ theory, once controversial, was becoming mainstream. Antiseptic procedures were becoming standard in hospitals. Vaccines were being developed for specific diseases. The X-ray was discovered, allowing doctors to see inside the body without surgery. Blood typing was being developed, making blood transfusions safer. And yet, these advances were still new, still not universally available or accepted. Many traditional practices persisted. Bloodletting was still being done in some places. Physicians still believed in many theories that would soon be proven wrong. The transition to modern medicine was gradual and uneven. For the average Victorian experiencing illness toward the end of the 19th century, life was still precarious. Recovery from serious illness was never certain. Death remained a constant possibility. The best that could be hoped for was that one's illness would be mild, that recovery would come naturally, and that if medical treatment was necessary, it would be administered by a competent physician who happened to be practicing one of the treatments that actually worked. Let us return now, with fresh perspective, to the material conditions of the Victorian home. We have discussed comfort and discomfort in broad terms, but there are specific, pressing realities of Victorian domestic life that deserve detailed attention. Among these, perhaps none is more fundamental or more often overlooked than the question of waste management and the provision of water. In a modern home, we often take for granted the systems that remove our waste from us. We use a toilet, we flush it, and the waste disappears into a system of pipes and treatment facilities that we rarely think about. But in the Victorian home, particularly for those without modern plumbing, the management of human waste was an immediate and constant concern. For those with indoor toilets, and this was a luxury available only to the relatively wealthy, the toilet often emptied into a cesspool beneath the house. This cesspool was not sealed and not regularly emptied. Over time, it would overflow, creating pits of stagnant, disease-ridden waste beneath the house. The smell, if the weather was warm or if the pit was nearly full, could permeate the entire building. Cholera and typhoid, both waterborne diseases, often spread through contamination from cesspools seeping into wells or water supplies. For those without indoor toilets, the situation was more immediate and more challenging. An outhouse, a small structure containing a seat with a hole beneath it, was the norm. The waste fell into a pit beneath. This pit attracted rats and insects. It smelled abominably, particularly in warm weather. The outhouse was typically located at some distance from the house, requiring a journey outside, often in cold or wet weather, to use it. And in some cases, in crowded tenement housing, there might be a single outhouse serving multiple families, leading to crowding, conflict, and inadequate maintenance. The provision of water was similarly challenging. In a modern home, clean water is provided through pipes connected to a municipal system. In a Victorian home, water had to be obtained from wells, pumps, or in some cases, delivered by cart. The water might be contaminated. Wells could be polluted by nearby cesspools, by agricultural runoff, by industrial waste. In cities, the water supply was often filthy. Cholera epidemics, which killed thousands in Victorian cities, were eventually traced to contaminated water supplies. The Great Cholera epidemic of 1854 in London was stopped only when a physician named John Snow removed the handle from a public pump on Broad Street, stopping people from using the contaminated water. Yet despite this discovery, and despite the gradual understanding of germ theory, contaminated water remained a constant problem throughout much of the Victorian era. We've already discussed the cold of the Victorian home, but the mechanisms by which heat was provided deserve specific attention, because they reveal the remarkable inefficiency and impracticality of Victorian domestic heating. The primary source of heat in most Victorian homes was the fireplace. A fire was built in the fireplace using wood or coal. The fire provided heat to the room in which it was located, but heat was lost rapidly up the chimney. The fireplace was remarkably inefficient. Much of the heat escaped before it could warm the room. A person standing in front of a fireplace might be quite warm, but a person sitting across the room would feel chilled. In very wealthy households, there might be multiple fireplaces, one in the drawing room, one in the dining room, perhaps one in the library or the morning room. But in a typical middle-class home, there might be only 2 or 3 fireplaces, certainly not enough to heat the entire house. As we discussed earlier, the bedrooms were typically not heated at all. The upper floors, where bedrooms were located, were significantly colder than the ground floor. The management of fires was a significant task. Fires had to be lit in the morning, before the family woke. This required servants to rise in the dark, to gather wood or coal, to arrange it in the fireplace, to use flint and steel or matches to light it, and to tend to it as it burned. If a fire went out during the day, it had to be relit. At night, if the fire was extinguished, the heat was lost. If the fire was allowed to burn all night, a significant amount of fuel was consumed. Coal, which became the primary fuel as the Victorian era progressed, had its own problems. It was expensive, so its use was limited. It produced smoke and soot, the black dust that settled on every surface and that the housemaids had to constantly clean. The smell of burning coal was pervasive, particularly in industrial areas where the air itself seemed saturated with soot. Before the widespread introduction of electric lighting, which did not become common until quite late in the Victorian era, and which many people remained suspicious of even then, the primary sources of light were candles and gas lamps. Candles were made of tallow, rendered animal fat, or, if one was wealthy, of wax. Tallow candles were cheap but burned poorly, producing a dim, flickering light and considerable smoke. Wax candles burned brighter and cleaner, but were expensive and therefore rare in ordinary households. The production of candlelight was labor-intensive. Candles had to be made, often by the household itself or by servants, or purchased. They burned down relatively quickly. In an evening of reading or other activity, multiple candles might be consumed. The cost of candles was a significant household expense. Gas lighting, when it became available, was initially seen as a great advance. Gas lamps provided brighter light than candles and could be turned on and off more easily. But gas lighting had its own problems. The gas had to be piped to the lamps through a network of pipes. The system was prone to leaks. If there was a leak, the smell of gas could become overwhelming. The gas could be dangerous. Explosions were possible if the gas accumulated in a confined space. Moreover, gas lighting was cold. Unlike candlelight or firelight, which provided some warmth as well as light, gas lamps provided only light, and somewhat harsh light at that, and the quality of the light, while brighter than candlelight, was still dim by modern standards. A room lit by gas lamps might seem quite bright to someone accustomed to candlelight, but it was still quite dim by the standards of modern electric lighting. The result was that Victorians lived with much less light than we do. Evenings were dim affairs. Reading was done by candlelight or gaslight, straining the eyes. Detailed work, sewing, fine needlework, was accomplished despite the poor lighting, often resulting in eye strain and headaches. The lack of light during the long winter months contributed to depression and seasonal affective disorder, though these conditions were not recognized or named as such in the Victorian era. We have discussed the constant need for cleaning in a Victorian household, but the reality of maintaining cleanliness in a Victorian home was essentially futile. The dirt was too great, too constant, and too omnipresent. The streets outside were unpaved or poorly paved, covered in mud in wet weather and dust in dry weather. When people entered the home, they brought this dirt with them on their shoes, on their clothes, on their bodies. Once inside, the dirt settled on every surface. The soot from fires and gas lamps added another layer of grime. The coal dust, if coal was stored near the house, created additional dirt. The carpets and rugs accumulated dirt, dust mites, and the waste products of these mites. The upholstered furniture, the sofas, the chairs, likewise accumulated dirt and became homes for insects and parasites. The bedding, despite being washed periodically, accumulated dust and dead skin cells. Fleas, lice, and other parasites were common, not as a sign of uncleanliness, but as an inevitable result of the environment. The Victorian household therefore existed in a state of constant battle against dirt. It was a battle that was never truly won. At best, it could be managed. Surfaces could be wiped, floors could be swept and mopped, carpets could be beaten to dislodge some of the accumulated dirt. But the dirt always returned. The effort required to maintain any semblance of cleanliness was enormous, consuming a significant portion of the servants' time and effort. The air quality in a Victorian home was poor. There were multiple sources of pollution. The fires and gas lamps produced smoke and fumes. The accumulated dirt and dust meant that the air was often thick with particles. In crowded households or tenements, the air was often foul with the smell of human waste, cooking, and other odors. And yet, ironically, while the air was polluted, it was also often cold and drafty. Ventilation was not controlled or planned. It happened through cracks in doors and windows, through gaps in the walls, through chimneys and other openings. The result was that the air moved unpredictably. Some rooms were stuffy and warm, others were cold and drafty. A person might sit in a draft all evening without realizing it was there, only to develop a cold or other illness from the exposure. The quality of the air indoors was often worse than the air outdoors, even in industrial cities where outdoor air pollution was significant. Yet Victorians often kept windows and doors closed, particularly at night, out of a fear of fresh air and a belief that stagnant air in the home was preferable to the exposure to the elements outside. The kitchen deserves specific attention as a space unto itself. The kitchen was typically the warmest room in the house because the stove or range, where food was cooked, generated significant heat. It was also the noisiest and the smelliest room. The smell of the kitchen was complex and powerful. There was the smell of cooking, meat being prepared, vegetables boiling, bread baking. There was the smell of smoke from the stove. There was the smell of waste, of garbage being accumulated for disposal. There was often a damp smell, because the kitchen was where large quantities of water were used. All of these smells combined to create a distinctive and pervasive odor that clung to the clothes and skin of those who worked there. The kitchen was where much of the household's labor took place. The cook worked at the stove for hours. The kitchen maid worked at various tasks. The scullery maid worked in the adjacent scullery. The heat from the stove made the kitchen uncomfortably warm in summer and provided some comfort in winter, but the prolonged heat was exhausting to those who worked there. The kitchen was also where much of the household's waste was accumulated. Vegetable scraps, meat bones, dishwater, other refuse accumulated in buckets and containers awaiting disposal. In warm weather, this waste began to ferment and decay, producing strong smells and attracting insects and rats. The bedroom, as we have discussed, was typically cold and dark, but there were other challenges to sleep in a Victorian bedroom. The noise was one factor. In urban areas, the sounds of the street carried into the bedroom despite the heavy curtains. The smell was another. Bed bugs, which were nearly universal in Victorian homes, released a distinctive smell when crushed, and their presence meant that sleep was often disturbed by bites and itching. The bed itself, as we have noted, was often uncomfortable. The mattress, stuffed with wool or horsehair, developed lumps and hollows. The sheets and blankets, despite being washed, often retained smells and were home to parasites. The pillows, filled with feathers or other materials, were often lumpy and uncomfortable. And the psychological factors, the knowledge that one was about to spend the night in a cold, dark room, possibly to be bitten by bedbugs, possibly to be awakened by the sounds of the household or the street. These could make falling asleep difficult despite the physical exhaustion. For those with bathrooms, and this was a luxury, the experience of bathing was different from the modern experience. A Victorian bathroom did not have a shower. There was typically a bathtub, which had to be filled with water that was heated on the stove and carried to the bathroom. The water was poured into the tub. The person bathed, using the cooling water. When finished, the dirty water had to be removed, drained, or carried out in buckets. A full bath consumed a significant amount of hot water, so it was not something done frequently. For most people, bathing was a weekly or monthly occurrence, not a daily practice. In between baths, people washed their hands and face, their feet, and perhaps their underarms, but did not fully bathe. The result was that most Victorians lived with a level of bodily cleanliness that would be considered unacceptable by modern standards. The accumulated sweat, dirt, and body oils meant that people had a distinctive body odor. This was masked or accepted through the use of perfumes and colognes, but it remained an underlying reality of Victorian life. Another distinctive feature of Victorian homes was the accumulation of objects. Wealthy, and even moderately well-off Victorians had many possessions: furniture, decorations, books, clothes, and various other items. These objects accumulated dust and dirt. They required maintenance and organization. They filled the rooms, making them feel crowded and busy, rather than open and spacious. The result was that a Victorian home, despite its elaborate architecture and design, often felt somewhat claustrophobic and cluttered. There were no empty walls, no bare shelves. Every surface held something. Every corner had a piece of furniture or a decoration. The cumulative effect of these various discomforts, the cold, the poor lighting, the dirt and smell, the crowded furnishings, the uncomfortable furniture, the lack of modern conveniences, was a sensory environment quite alien to modern experience. The Victorian home was dark, cold, smelly, and uncomfortable by modern standards. And yet, for those who lived in Victorian homes, this was simply the environment in which life took place. It was not experienced as unusual or particularly unpleasant because there was no reference point for comparison. A Victorian person did not know what it was like to have electric lighting, indoor plumbing, central heating, or any of the other amenities that we consider basic. For them, the conditions of their home were simply the conditions of existence. But if a modern person were to step into a Victorian home, particularly a poorly maintained one, or a working-class home, or a servant's quarters, they would be immediately struck by the cold, the darkness, the smells, and the general discomfort. These were the realities of Victorian domestic life. We have explored the physical spaces of the Victorian home, the material conditions, the sensory environment. But there is another dimension to understanding why a modern person would not last 24 hours in a Victorian house, and that is the question of time itself, how time was structured, how days were organized, how the rhythm of life was fundamentally different from our own. The Victorian day was highly structured and ritualized. For those of leisure, the middle and upper classes, the day followed a predictable pattern that varied only slightly from day to day. For those who worked, servants and laborers, the day was structured around work, but the work itself had its own rhythm and routine. Let us begin with the morning. We have already discussed the experience of waking in a cold bedroom, but the morning extended beyond this initial discomfort. After washing and dressing, one proceeded to breakfast. Breakfast was a meal, not merely a quick consumption of food. It might take 30 minutes or more. During breakfast, one might read the newspaper, if it had arrived. One might converse with other members of the household. After breakfast, the day's activities began. For a working person, this meant proceeding to work. For a woman of leisure, this might mean letter writing, management of household accounts, or reading. For a man of leisure, this might mean going to his club, conducting business, or engaging in some form of recreation. For middle and upper class women, much of the day was consumed by social obligations. Chief among these were calls, visits to other women in one's social circle. These calls were highly ritualized events with specific rules and expectations. A call was made in the afternoon, typically between 2 and 4 o'clock. One dressed in one's calling outfit, a specific type of clothing worn for this purpose. One went to the home of the person being called upon. Upon arrival, one was admitted by a servant who announced the visitor. The hostess received the visitor in the drawing room. The conversation followed a specific pattern: inquiries about health, discussion of recent events, perhaps discussion of upcoming social events or gossip about mutual acquaintances. The call was brief, typically lasting only 15 to 30 minutes. If the hostess was not at home, the visitor would leave a calling card, a small card with her name on it, and depart. If there were multiple calls to be made in an afternoon, which was typical, one might visit 4, 5, or even 6 homes in a single afternoon. These calls were not optional. They were required to maintain one's social position. A woman who did not make her calls would be considered antisocial or proud. A woman who did not receive calls would be considered not worth calling upon. The system was designed to maintain and reinforce social hierarchies, and to create a network of social obligation and connection among women of similar class. The energy expended on these calls was considerable. One had to be constantly pleasant, engaging, and appropriate. One had to be interested in what others had to say while revealing little of one's own genuine feelings or interests. One had to manage one's appearance, one's behavior, and one's speech in accordance with strict social norms. By the time the afternoon's calls were completed, a woman could be exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the constant performance and social engagement required. The middle of the day was marked by lunch. Lunch was a lighter meal than breakfast or dinner, typically taken around midday. For working people, lunch might be taken at the place of work or might be a quick affair at home. For people of leisure, lunch might be taken at home or, increasingly as the Victorian era progressed, at a restaurant or hotel. The provision of lunch created its own demands. Food had to be prepared or purchased. Servants had to organize and serve it. For those taking lunch out, there was the time and effort of going to a restaurant, ordering, waiting for food to be prepared, and consuming it. The afternoon was theoretically a time of leisure, but Victorian leisure was itself a complex and demanding affair. Reading was a common occupation, novels, newspapers, periodicals, but reading was often done by poor light, straining the eyes and causing headaches. Moreover, reading material was not unlimited. Books were expensive, and even those of moderate means might have only a small library. Needlework, sewing, embroidery, needlepoint was another common occupation, particularly for women. This work was productive in a sense, creating or maintaining clothing or decorative items, but it was also tedious, requiring long hours of repetitive work in poor light. The work could cause eye strain, back pain from bending over, and a general fatigue. Some people occupied themselves with music, playing the piano or another instrument. But this required having an instrument, having received instruction in music, and having sufficient skill to play with some competence. For most people, music was not a personal activity but something experienced in the company of others. Walking was a common form of recreation, particularly in good weather. But walking in Victorian dress was itself demanding. Heavy skirts and multiple layers of clothing restricted movement. Tight shoes and improper support meant that walking for long periods could be painful. Moreover, the streets themselves were often unpleasant, muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry weather, filled with horse manure, and populated with people engaged in various forms of commerce and labor. By mid-afternoon, around 4 o'clock, tea was served. Tea was not merely a beverage, it was an elaborate meal. There was tea, the hot drink, and there were various accompaniments, small sandwiches, cakes, pastries, biscuits. Tea was often served in a specific room of the house, the tea room or drawing room, and was a social occasion. If you had invited guests or had been invited to someone's home for tea, this was a formal social occasion with its own rules and expectations. If you were taking tea alone or with family members, it was still a structured moment in the day, a pause and a refreshment before the evening activities. As evening approached, somewhere around 7 or 8 o'clock, depending on the season and the social class, dinner was served. Dinner was the main meal of the day, the most elaborate and time-consuming meal. For those of means, dinner was a significant social event. Preparation for dinner began well in advance. One dressed in formal clothing, an evening gown for women, evening dress with specific insignia for men. Hairstyles were arranged. Jewelry was selected. This preparation could take an hour or more. The dinner itself lasted an hour or more, sometimes considerably longer if it was a formal dinner party. The meal consisted of multiple courses, each with its appropriate wine or beverage. The conversation followed specific patterns. There were rules about what could be discussed, how one addressed other people, how one handled oneself at the table. The entire affair was choreographed. Servants moved through the room in a specific pattern, clearing courses and bringing new ones. Everyone moved through the meal at roughly the same pace. There was a rhythm to it all. For a servant preparing and serving this dinner, the work was equally demanding. The kitchen staff worked for hours to prepare the meal. The servants serving the meal moved through the evening managing multiple tables, multiple courses, and the complex requirements of formal dining service. After dinner, if it was an ordinary evening at home, one might retire to the drawing room. Here, the evening's activities took place. These might include conversation, reading, music, or games, cards, chess, or other diversions. The gas lamps or candles provided light, dim and somewhat hard on the eyes for these activities. If it was a special evening, there might be entertainment, a musical performance by a guest or a professional musician, a reading of poetry or literature, a theatrical performance by amateur actors. These events required organization, rehearsal, and specific preparation. They were considered entertaining and enriching, providing a break from the routine of daily life. But the reality of these entertainments was that they were often rather tedious. A musical performance by an amateur, while perhaps not unpleasant, might not be particularly skillfully done. A reading might go on for hours. A theatrical performance might be amateurish and somewhat awkward. Yet one sat through these events, maintaining an attentive and appreciative demeanor, because this was what was expected. As late evening approached, 10 o'clock or later, the household began to wind down. Servants cleared away the items from the evening's activities. The fires were banked to burn slowly through the night. The gas lamps or candles were extinguished or turned down. People prepared for bed. The preparation for bed involved undressing, which was a time-consuming process for those wearing the elaborate clothing of the era. Corsets had to be unlaced. Multiple layers of clothing had to be removed. Hair had to be let down from whatever arrangement it had been in. In some cases, preparations for the next day's clothing or appearance involved time and effort. Once in bed, in the cold darkness of the bedroom, one settled in for the night. Sleep might not come immediately. The cold, the discomfort of the bed, the sounds of the house, or the sounds from the street outside might interfere with sleep. But eventually, if circumstances were favorable, sleep would come. The rhythm of the Victorian day, as we have described it, was the rhythm for those of means and leisure. For working people, the rhythm was different but equally structured. Factory workers worked for 10, 12, or more hours, with perhaps a brief break for lunch. Domestic servants worked throughout the day and often into the evening, with perhaps a few hours in the afternoon or evening to themselves. The rhythm was also similar from day to day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They followed similar patterns. The week was marked by Sunday, when most work ceased, or was different in character, and religious observance took place. But beyond this, the days were remarkably similar one to another. The month had some variation: rent days, market days, days on which specific tasks were typically done. The year had some variation. Seasons brought different activities, social events marked the calendar. But overall, the experience was one of considerable routine and repetition. This routine had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it created predictability and a sense of order. One knew, generally, what each day would bring. There was comfort in routine. On the other hand, the routine could be monotonous and limiting. There was little room for spontaneity, for deviation from expected patterns, for the pursuit of individual desires and interests. The rigid structuring of time in Victorian society had psychological impacts that are difficult for modern people to appreciate. We are accustomed to some flexibility in our schedules, to the ability to deviate from routine if we choose. We have multiple distractions available to us: technology, entertainment, information, that provide constant novelty and engagement. A Victorian person, by contrast, lived within a much more constrained temporal framework. Time was structured by external forces, by social obligation, by work demands, by the rhythms of nature. There was less flexibility, less opportunity for novelty, less escape from routine. For some people, this structure was stabilizing and comfortable. For others, particularly those with intellectual or creative interests, it could be stifling and frustrating. Women, in particular, often found themselves constrained by the demands of social obligation and domestic duty, with little opportunity to pursue their own interests or intellectual development. The monotony of Victorian temporal existence, the repetition of days, the predictability of events, the limited variation in activity, contributed to the various complaints about nerves, about depression, about malaise that appear so frequently in Victorian medical literature and correspondence. People experienced, though they might not have named it as such, a kind of existential fatigue from the repetition and constraint of their lives. As we move toward the conclusion of this extended meditation on Victorian existence, it is worth noting that the Victorian sleep cycle was different from our own. Without electric lighting, people went to sleep earlier and woke earlier. The long darkness of winter made sleep a natural refuge. In summer, when daylight extended well into the evening, sleep came later and people woke earlier. The rhythm of sleep was disrupted by various factors. Discomfort, the cold, the hard bed, bedbugs, could interrupt sleep. Dreams were often vivid and sometimes disturbing. The darkness and silence of the Victorian night, so different from the ambient light and sound of the modern world, created a different quality of sleep. Many Victorians experienced sleep fragmentation, sleeping for a few hours, then waking for a period of time, then sleeping again. This was considered normal, and was sometimes referred to as first sleep and second sleep. The waking period between sleeps was sometimes used for quiet activities, reading, prayer, or intimate relations with one's spouse. The overall quantity of sleep was often greater than in the modern era. With less to do in the evening and an earlier bedtime, Victorians often slept longer. But the quality of sleep was often compromised by discomfort and disruption. We have now journeyed through an entire Victorian day. We have felt the cold of waking, endured the restriction of clothing, experienced the accumulation of discomforts. We have descended beneath the surface to see the hidden labor that made comfort possible. We have traced the arc of a Victorian lifetime, understanding how constraint becomes normalized. We have explored the material conditions, the dirt, the cold, the poor lighting, the smell, that surrounded Victorian existence. We have understood the temporal structure, the rigid routine, the predictability that both comforted and constrained. And now we can return to the question with which we began. Why would you not last 24 hours in a Victorian house? The answer is not simple. It is not that any one thing would drive you away. It is not the cold alone, or the restriction of clothing alone, or the poor lighting alone. Rather, it is the accumulation of all of these discomforts, operating simultaneously and persistently, wearing at your patience and your physical resilience. By the end of that first day, you would be exhausted. Not from labor necessarily, but from the constant adaptation required. Your body would ache from sitting in uncomfortable chairs, from the restriction of tight clothing, from the cold. Your eyes would hurt from straining to see by dim light. Your skin would feel irritated and itchy from the dust and dirt. Your hands would be cold and slightly chapped from washing in lukewarm water. Your back would ache from the weight of the heavy clothing and from the posture required by corsetry or formal dress. Your mind would be weary from the constant performance required, the maintenance of proper behavior, the navigation of social rules, the awareness of hierarchy and expectation. Even if you had spent the day in relative leisure, you would be exhausted by the psychological demands of maintaining propriety, and the night would bring, not relief, but different challenges. The cold bedroom would be unwelcoming, the lumpy bed would be uncomfortable, the darkness would be profound. The cold would penetrate through the blankets, sleep might not come easily, and you would know that tomorrow you would wake and do it all again. By the second morning, you might begin to seriously contemplate escape. The cold, which seemed merely uncomfortable on the first morning, would feel unbearable on the second. The discomforts that seemed manageable yesterday would feel cumulative today, and the knowledge that this is how people lived, day after day, year after year, might become overwhelming. But this brings us to a profound question. How did people actually manage? How did they live not for 24 hours, but for years, decades, their entire lives in these conditions? The answer lies in the remarkable capacity of human beings to adapt to their circumstances. Humans are creatures of context. We normalize what we experience repeatedly. We accept as natural what we have always known. We rarely, as a species, experience our own circumstances as unbearable unless we have a reference point for comparison. A Victorian child, born into a cold house, wearing restrictive clothing from infancy, breathing air thick with coal dust, experiencing the constant hierarchies of Victorian society. That child would grow up and experience all of this as simply the normal conditions of existence. There would be no moment of rebellion against the cold, because the child would not know that warmth was possible. There would be no desperate longing for electric light, because the child would not know such light existed. The body itself adapts. Hands that are constantly washed in cold water develop a tolerance for cold that might astonish a modern person. Eyes that strain in dim light gradually adapt to see better in low light conditions. Skin that is constantly irritated develops a kind of hardened tolerance. The body changes and adapts to its environment over time. The mind also adapts. What seems unbearable at first becomes routine. The constraint becomes comfortable because it is familiar. The lack of freedom becomes acceptable because one cannot imagine freedom. The monotony of routine becomes soothing because it provides predictability and structure. This is perhaps the most important truth about historical periods. They were not experienced as dystopias by those living in them. They were experienced as normal. People were born, lived, and died within these systems, and for most of them, the system seemed natural and inevitable. But adaptation was not merely physical and psychological, it was also cultural and spiritual. The Victorian world was not a meaningless one for those living in it. It was full of meaning, religious meaning, social meaning, personal meaning. For many Victorians, religious faith provided a framework for understanding suffering and constraint. The difficulties of life were seen as part of God's plan, as opportunities for virtue and moral development. Suffering was not meaningless, it was redemptive. The cold, the discomfort, the labor, these could be understood as part of one's spiritual journey. Social position and hierarchy provided another form of meaning. One's place in society while constraining also provided identity and purpose. A servant understood herself as part of a household, performing essential labor. A middle-class woman understood herself as the manager of a household, the moral center of the family. An aristocrat understood himself as having responsibilities of leadership and stewardship. Even when these positions were constrained and difficult, they provided a sense of purpose and belonging. Family and intimate relationships provided meaning as well. People loved their family members, their friends, their colleagues. They found moments of joy in each other's company. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They experienced the full range of human emotions and connections within the Victorian framework. Moreover, people found joy and beauty in their world. They appreciated natural beauty, gardens, landscapes, the changing seasons. They found aesthetic satisfaction in art, music, literature. They experienced humor and laughter. They took pride in their work, their homes, and their accomplishments. To suggest that Victorian life was merely suffering and constraint would be to miss the full texture of human experience. People found ways to be happy, to find meaning, to create beauty within the constraints of their world. Not everyone, certainly. Some people were crushed by their circumstances, driven to despair or rebellion. But many people found ways to live reasonably satisfying lives within the Victorian system. It would be a mistake to conclude our examination of Victorian life with only an emphasis on discomfort and constraint. There were moments of genuine comfort and joy. A fire on a cold evening, particularly when shared with loved ones, could provide real warmth and comfort. A meal that was well prepared and pleasantly served could be a genuine source of satisfaction. A conversation with a friend or family member could provide moments of connection and understanding. A book that truly engaged the mind could provide escape and enjoyment. A piece of music, heard in a concert or played by someone you loved, could move the emotions. A child falling asleep in a safe, familiar bed, wrapped in warm blankets, knowing that parents and servants were near. This child was experiencing genuine comfort and security. An elderly person, reflecting on a life well lived, surrounded by family and grandchildren, this person could experience satisfaction and peace. The Victorian world, for all its constraints and discomforts, was also capable of producing moments of beauty, connection, and genuine human satisfaction. As we move toward the conclusion of this extended meditation on Victorian existence, it is worth considering why Victorian conditions changed, why the modern world emerged and gradually replaced the Victorian system. The conditions we have described were not inevitable or permanent. They were the result of specific historical circumstances, the level of technology available, the social structures that had developed, the distribution of labor and resources. As technology advanced, as medicine progressed, as social movements challenged existing hierarchies, Victorian conditions gradually changed. Electric lighting, central heating, indoor plumbing, modern medicine, mechanized labor. These developments did not emerge overnight, but they transformed life gradually over time. By the early 20th century, in wealthier nations, the material conditions of life for many people had improved significantly compared to the mid-Victorian era. Life was warmer, brighter, cleaner, less physically demanding. But these improvements were not distributed equally. For much of the 20th century, and continuing into the present, people in less wealthy nations, or in poorer regions of wealthy nations, continued to live in conditions not radically different from those of Victorian-era working classes. The disparities between rich and poor persisted, and in some ways intensified. The transformation from Victorian to modern conditions was not automatic or inevitable. It resulted from technological innovation, from labor organizing and political movements that demanded better conditions, from scientific advances that improved medicine and public health. People fought for better conditions, and gradually those conditions improved. In examining Victorian life, we must also consider what was lost in the transition to modernity. The constraints and difficulties of Victorian existence had certain effects, some of which were not entirely negative. The rigid structure of Victorian time, while constraining, also provided stability and predictability. Relationships between people were governed by specific expectations and protocols, which could be stifling, but which also provided clarity and a kind of security. Communities were more tightly knit, as people necessarily interacted with those in their immediate vicinity over many years. Work, while often difficult and sometimes brutal, was often more directly connected to visible results and to community well-being. In our modern world, we have gained comfort, freedom, and convenience, but we have also, in some ways, lost connection to our communities, to the rhythms of nature, to the satisfaction of direct labor and visible results. We experience a kind of freedom that can feel paradoxically isolating and empty. We have the luxury of choice in many domains, but we often experience this choice as burdensome rather than liberating. This is not to suggest that a return to Victorian conditions would be desirable. The comfort, the medicine, the freedom from backbreaking labor are genuine goods that improve human life. Rather, it is to acknowledge that modernization involved trade-offs. We gained in some domains and lost in others. As we near the end of this journey through Victorian existence, one final reflection is worth considering. The specific conditions of Victorian life were distinctive. The cold, the corsets, the gas lamps, the servants, the hierarchies. But the human experience beneath these specific circumstances was not so different from human experience in any era. People experienced cold and discomfort, and they adapted. People experienced constraint and limitation, and they found meaning within those constraints. People experienced labor and difficulty, and they took pride in their work. People experienced loss and suffering, and they found ways to endure. People experienced joy and connection, and they treasured those moments. Humans are remarkably resilient creatures. We are capable of adapting to almost any circumstances. We are capable of finding meaning and beauty even in difficult situations. We are capable of forming genuine connections and experiencing love even in highly constrained social systems. The Victorians were not fundamentally different from us. They did not have different bodies or different minds or different emotional capacities. They simply lived in different material and social circumstances, and within those circumstances they lived their lives. They suffered and rejoiced. They loved and lost. They worked and rested. They dreamed and despaired. They lived and died. And so we return, at last, to the present moment. You, who have spent these hours in imaginative exploration of Victorian existence, can now return to your own world. You can turn on a light with the press of a button. You can adjust the temperature with a thermostat. You can take a hot shower. You can access medical care. You can make choices about how to spend your time. These comforts are genuine and valuable. They represent real improvements in human life and well-being. But now, having experienced even imaginatively the conditions of Victorian life, you might have a deeper appreciation for these comforts. You might understand, in a more visceral way, what previous generations had to endure. You might have a clearer sense of gratitude for the achievements of human innovation and the efforts of people who fought for better conditions. And perhaps, Having spent time imagining the constraints and difficulties of another era, you might also have a deeper appreciation for the human capacity to adapt, to find meaning, to endure, to create beauty and connection even in difficult circumstances. This capacity, which allowed Victorians to live reasonably satisfying lives in cold, dark, uncomfortable houses, is the same capacity that allows all of us to navigate our own lives and circumstances. So, returning to the question with which we began, why would you not last 24 hours in a Victorian house? The answer is that you would not last 24 hours because you are adapted to a different world. Your body expects warmth, your eyes expect adequate light, your skin expects cleanliness, your ears expect certain ambient sounds, your mind expects certain freedoms and options. The Victorian house would violate all of these expectations, and the accumulation of these violations would eventually drive you to seek escape. But a person born into that Victorian house, living their entire life within those conditions, would experience them not as unbearable violations, but as simply the way the world is. They would adapt. They would find ways to be comfortable, to find beauty, to experience joy. They would live their lives fully and meaningfully within those constraints. This is the paradox and the profound truth of human existence. Our circumstances shape us profoundly, yet we are capable of experiencing satisfaction and meaning within nearly any circumstances. The world around us seems natural and inevitable to us, because we have never known anything different, but other worlds, other ways of living are possible. As this extended examination of Victorian life comes to an end, let us rest for a moment in reflection. We have journeyed through a day, through a lifetime, through the entire span of Victorian society. We have descended into the cold bedrooms and the hot kitchens, into the minds, servants and aristocrats, into the experiences of those living in comfort and those living in desperate poverty. And in doing so, we have not merely examined history, we have examined ourselves, our resilience, our adaptability, our capacity to find meaning and joy. We have considered what we have gained and what we have perhaps lost in our transition to modernity. We have contemplated the universal human experience that transcends any particular historical period. The Victorians are gone now. Their houses still stand in some places, preserved as museums and monuments to a vanished world. But the people themselves, with their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys, have passed into history. And yet, in understanding their lives, we understand something about our own. We understand that we too are shaped by our circumstances, that we too will someday be looked back upon by future generations as inhabitants of a vanished world. This is the strange gift that history offers us, the opportunity to see ourselves in others, to understand that we are part of a vast human continuum, stretching back into the past and forward into the future. And in that understanding, we find not merely the satisfaction of curiosity about how others lived, but a deeper sense of connection to the human experience itself. We have been together now for 2 hours, or at least we have traveled through 2 hours of Victorian time. We have moved from that cold morning in a Victorian bedroom, through the day's accumulations of discomfort, through the hidden stories of servants and the full arc of Victorian life. We have descended into the material conditions of Victorian existence, and ascended into its temporal and psychological dimensions. We have explored medicine and domestic space, social hierarchy and human resilience. And now, as this extended meditation draws to a close, we find ourselves approaching that place where all journeys through time must end, the present moment, the here and now, the comfortable space in which you are listening to these words. Let us, for a moment, pause in this return. Let us not rush immediately back to the familiar. Rather, let us linger in the liminal space between Victorian time and modern time, between the past we have explored and the present we inhabit. Before we conclude, it would be remiss not to acknowledge the genuine legacies that the Victorian era left to us. For all the discomfort and constraint we have described, the Victorian period was also an era of extraordinary creativity, innovation, and human achievement. In literature, the Victorians produced some of the greatest novels ever written. the psychological depth of novels by authors like George Eliot, the social consciousness of Charles Dickens, the Gothic mysteries of the Bronte sisters. These works explored the human condition with extraordinary insight and remain vital and relevant to modern readers. The Victorians created poetry that still moves us, that still speaks to human experience. In science, the Victorians made extraordinary discoveries. Darwin's theory of evolution fundamentally transformed our understanding of life. The development of germ theory revolutionized medicine and public health. Innovations in physics, chemistry, and mathematics laid the foundations for the modern scientific age. The Victorian era was a time of remarkable intellectual ferment and discovery. In engineering and technology, the Victorians created marvels. The development of railways, the construction of great bridges and buildings, the innovation of new manufacturing processes, these achievements transformed the material world and made possible the modern age. The Great Exhibition of 1851 displayed the full range of Victorian innovation and ambition. In art and design, the Victorians created beauty. The pre-Raphaelite painters, the arts and crafts movement, the innovations in architecture, all of these represented attempts to create beauty and meaning in a rapidly changing world. Much Victorian art and design remains beautiful and valued today. In social reform, Victorians fought against slavery, for workers' rights, for education for all children, for improvements in public health and sanitation. These movements were often opposed by those with power and wealth, and progress was slow. But the seeds of the modern social safety net, of universal education, of public health, were planted by Victorian reformers and activists. The Victorians, for all their constraints and their problematic attitudes by modern standards, were also people of tremendous creativity, intelligence, and moral seriousness. They grappled with the great questions of their era: how to reconcile faith and science, how to manage rapid social change, how to create justice and beauty in a new industrial world. Their struggles remain relevant to us. As we approach the end of this journey, there is another reflection worth considering. In modern life, we have achieved unprecedented levels of comfort, convenience, and freedom. We have eliminated or significantly reduced many of the discomforts that plagued the Victorian era. This is genuinely good. It is right to be grateful for these achievements, but in doing so, we have also eliminated many constraints. And not all constraint is bad. Constraint can be the mother of creativity. The strict forms of Victorian literature, the sonnet, the novel with its particular conventions, provided structure within which extraordinary creativity flourished. The constraints of Victorian social structure, oppressive though they could be, also provided clarity and shared understanding about certain things. We live now in an era of unprecedented freedom and choice. We can be nearly anyone we want to be. We can pursue nearly any interest we choose. We can remake ourselves multiple times over the course of our lives. This freedom is valuable and has produced genuine benefits. But it can also be paralyzing. The absence of constraint can leave us unmoored, uncertain about who we are or what we should do. The Victorians, living within much tighter constraints, often had a clearer sense of identity and purpose. They knew who they were supposed to be, what they were supposed to do, what was expected of them. This clarity, while limiting, also provided a kind of stability and peace. It is perhaps worth considering whether we have lost something valuable in our modern pursuit of unlimited choice and freedom. Another reflection emerges as we contemplate Victorian existence from our modern vantage point: the question of pace. The Victorian world moved more slowly than ours. Communication was slower, travel was slower, commerce was slower. But this slowness meant that people spent more time with each person, each task, each experience. A Victorian man might spend an entire evening in conversation with friends, with no distractions, no alternative entertainments available, no temptation to check a device for news or messages. This forced attention created a different quality of relationship and conversation. A Victorian woman might spend hours on a needlework project, moving through the work slowly and mindfully. This slowness created a different relationship with the work, not as a means to an end, but as an experience in itself. We have gained much in our acceleration of pace. We can accomplish more, we can know more, we can connect with more people. But we have also lost something: the ability to be fully present in a moment, the experience of depth and contemplation, the satisfaction of slow work completed over time. The Victorians, as we have discussed, lived within rigid routines. Every day followed a similar pattern. Meals came at predictable times. Social obligations followed a predictable calendar. This routine was constraining, but it was also comforting in certain ways. A modern person might be struck by how exhausting choice and novelty can be. We must decide every day what to eat, what to wear, how to spend our time. We have so many options that decision-making itself becomes fatiguing. We are bombarded with novel information and stimuli constantly. We are never entirely at rest. The Victorian routine, while limiting, also offered respite. One knew what one was going to do. One did not have to constantly make decisions. There was a kind of peace in this predictability, even as it was frustrating for those who desired freedom or change. And so, as we prepare to conclude this extended meditation on Victorian life, we come to the natural place where all such meditations lead, toward rest, toward sleep, toward the closure of consciousness that allows us to begin anew tomorrow. You have been with us through the cold morning, through the accumulation of discomforts, through centuries of history compressed into hours. You have inhabited, imaginatively, the bodies and minds and circumstances of people who lived a century or more ago. You have felt the weight of their clothing, breathed the air of their homes, experienced the constraints of their existence, and now, having done so, you can return to the comfort of your own present moment. You can feel the softness of your bed, the adequacy of the temperature in your room, the accessibility of light when you need it. You can appreciate, with greater depth than before, the comfort in which you rest. But as you drift toward sleep, there is one final reflection worth carrying with you. We have examined the Victorian era as something past, as a world fundamentally different from our own, and in many ways, it was. The material conditions were different. The social structures were different. The technological possibilities were different. And yet, we should not imagine that our own era is somehow final, that the world we know now is the culmination of history. Future generations, looking back at our time, will likely find aspects of our existence as strange, as difficult to imagine, as unnecessarily constrained, as we find the Victorian era. Perhaps they will wonder why we spent so much time staring at glowing screens. Perhaps they will marvel at the inequality and injustice that persisted in our world despite our wealth and technology. Perhaps they will be astonished at the environmental damage we caused and accepted. Perhaps they will find our customs around work and achievement as rigid and constraining as we find Victorian customs around dress and propriety. And this realization, that we are not outside of history, that our era will seem strange and limited to those who come after, should give us a certain humility. It should remind us that we, too, are creatures of our time, shaped by our circumstances, limited by our perspective, unable to see the changes that future generations will see with clarity. What this extended journey through Victorian existence offers us, then, is not merely historical knowledge or nostalgic appreciation for a vanished world. Rather, it offers us the practice of imagination, the capacity to enter into different circumstances, to understand different perspectives, to appreciate how profoundly context shapes experience and possibility. This practice of imagination is valuable not merely as an historical exercise, but as a way of developing empathy and understanding in the present moment. The more we can imagine ourselves into different circumstances, not just the Victorian past, but the experiences of people different from us in our own time, the more we can understand the diversity of human experience and the ways in which our own circumstances seem natural and inevitable only because we have never known anything different. Imagination, in this sense, is not escape from reality. It is a deepening engagement with reality. It is a way of expanding our understanding of what is possible, what is human, what is worth valuing. And so, as this meditation nears its end, we invite you to let go of the Victorian past and return fully to the present moment. Feel the comfort of your bed. Notice the temperature of your room. Appreciate the absence of constraint. Let the muscles in your face relax. Let your breathing become slower and deeper. The Victorians are long gone now. Their world has passed away. but the human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for finding meaning and beauty. This persists, and it persists in you, listening to these words, resting in the comfort that your era has provided. The Victorian era teaches us that humans are capable of remarkable endurance, of accepting and adapting to circumstances that would seem unbearable to us. But it also teaches us that these circumstances were not inevitable, that they changed and could be changed through innovation, through struggle, through the efforts of people who worked for something better. We live in the world those people created, and though that world has its own difficulties and limitations, it is in many ways profoundly more comfortable and freer than the Victorian world. This is something to be grateful for. This is something to carry with us as we rest. Your eyes are growing heavy now. The weight of this extended meditation, the journey through time, the accumulation of images and reflections, all of this creates a natural inclination towards sleep. Let yourself drift toward that state. Let the boundaries between waking and sleeping become blurred. Think, if you will, of a Victorian bedroom, not as a place of discomfort and cold, but as a place of rest and refuge. Think of the sound of wind outside, of the weight of blankets, of the knowledge that tomorrow will bring its own experiences, its own challenges, its own small comforts and joys. The Victorians slept in cold, dark rooms, and they woke and lived their lives. We sleep in warmer, brighter spaces, and we wake and live our lives. The external circumstances are different, but the fundamental experience of rest, of sleep, of the renewal that comes from unconsciousness, this remains human, this remains universal. And so we come at last to the place where all stories lead, toward silence, toward the dissolution of consciousness, toward the gentle drift into sleep. And in sleep, perhaps you will dream of Victorian drawing rooms and cold bedrooms, or perhaps you will dream of something entirely different. Either way, you will rest, and in the morning you will wake to your own world, with a perhaps deeper appreciation for its comforts and its possibilities. We are at the threshold now, the boundary between waking and sleeping, the place where the journey through Victorian time concludes and the return to the present begins. It is time, now, to let go. Let go of the cold and the constraint, the hierarchy and the hidden labor. Let go of the discomfort and the beauty, the meaning and the struggle that we have traced across these 2 hours. Hold only this, the understanding that humans are resilient, that we adapt to our circumstances, that we find beauty and meaning even in difficult times. Hold the gratitude for the comfort in which you rest. Hold the humility that comes from knowing that future generations will find our own era strange and limited, in ways we cannot yet imagine. And as you drift into sleep, know that this journey through the Victorian past is itself something that could not have happened in that past era. The ability to imagine ourselves into another time, to explore history through recorded voice and extended meditation, to rest in comfort while contemplating discomfort. This is a gift of our modern age. This, too, is something to be grateful for.